So, welcome back to another episode of Dean's Discussions. Today we're joined with John Ferry, Spectator writer, Lib Dem finance spokesman. Also joined by Margaret Curran, Scottish Labour, former MP, former Secretary of State for Scotland, amongst many other briefs.
Shadow Secretary.
Shadow, forgive me, Shadow. And today we're going to be looking at Scotland's economy, pre and post-pandemic. We're going to look at structural weaknesses, talk about the various problems that are long set, and we'll get into how we can probably fix them. So inequalities, government policy action, there'll be lots and lots and lots to talk about. Before we begin, I'll do what I always do. I'll open up with an opening spiel from me to sort of set a sort of context, and then I'll throw it open for my guests to chew into. And I thought I'd start in 2008. Why? Well, in 2008, 2 days after the Lehman Brothers were put into bankruptcy in London, the Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson, and Bernd Bernanke, the head of the Federal Reserve at the time, walk into the George W. Bush Oval Office and say we need $1 trillion in cash by 5 p.m. or the entire financial system will collapse in 2 weeks. First in America, then the Bank of England, European Central Bank, Bank of Tokyo, the whole thing goes. The end of the financial system as we know it, no more cash come out of cash machines, anarchy. Now, these are not men who were given to hyperbole. These were, in the case of Hank Paulson, highly professional finance secretary, financial operator with a background in Goldman Sachs. So why am I starting there? Well, what happens in America in 2008 cast an exceptionally long shadow, and Scotland has certainly not been exempt from it. We are today dealing with issues around stagnant productivity, poor GDP growth per head and overall. Ever since, we've had inflation that is now rip-roaring through the economy. And my contention is, whilst the pandemic definitely exacerbated all of this, it certainly was not the cause of many of these problems. They go right back to the financial crisis, and perhaps in some cases even before. In the case of inflation, right now, the UK, including Scotland's facing producer price inflation inputs of over 22%. That's global supply chains that are in a state of disruption. China's zero COVID strategy, property market problems in the Chinese economy with China Evergrande basically going bankrupt, which is absolutely terrifying. The Russia-Ukraine war, huge disruption to supply chains, driving producer inflation to the highest point since 1985, when we started recording it. And factory gate prices are over 15% and likely to go higher. So producer inflation is causing huge disruption to the economy. So farmers, etc., any of these producers who would then sell to retailers or third parties are being absolutely squeezed. The long roots go back to our policy response after the financial crisis. The Bank of England and the American Central Bank and everyone else decided that what we'd do is mass printing of money, flood the zone with liquidity, interest rates of 0% for over, on and off for over a decade. And what you end up is, if you owned stocks in the last 15 years, if you owned intellectual property rights, you've had the best run in human history. If you're a worker, you've been screwed. Not to put too fine a point on it. Real estate has also been a boon. But if you're the little guy encouraged to save, you've been absolutely just decimated. If you're looking for a bond offering in America, for example, to build a new school extension, there's simply not been enough juice in the offering to make that happen. So it's been absolutely horrendous. And when the Bank of England floods the zone with electronic money, which is what it has been doing, just magicking this up since 2008, and you use it to buy government bonds and gilts. The problem is this creates inflation, or it can create inflation, not least because if, for example, you overestimate how much liquidity is required, you create inflation. And we've had the financial crisis, quantitative easing, which is basically electronic printing of money to buy government bonds and gilts to try and create like tons and tons of liquidity. And then we did the same thing again after the pandemic. All of this creates huge inflationary pressures and is not sustainable. So we've had inflationary problems. It goes back a long way. And of course, you can't just pull a U-turn and just shove interest rates up as fast as you can, because that creates a whole bunch of other economic problems. So you have to turn course, but do it very slowly. And it's a mess. It's been a real mess. Quantitative easing was never free, but we certainly became addicted to it economically. So there's that. We've got aging population. Scotland has, according to some studies, faces an old age dependency ratio of 48% by 2037, higher than the UK overall, which would be expected to be 45%. Higher age dependency means greater burden on the working population to support the growing number of old people in terms of services and support. Economic performance, Scottish GDP 2006 to 2018. Scottish GDP per head of population was continually lower than the UK equivalents. Why? Because Scotland's economically structurally too reliant on oil and gas in the North Sea. In 2014-15, the oil price problems hit the Scottish economy, slowing down our GDP, but not just for oil and gas, also all the manufacturing sectors, all the sectors directly connected and tied into the supply chains around the North Sea to manufacturing. So Scotland's economically, structurally, not as dynamic as it needs to be. And lastly, I'll touch on productivity. Now, productivity in Scotland, according to CBI KPMG, Scottish Productivity Index of 2019, was by 2019 stagnant, globally stagnant for 15 years. So fast forward to today, you're talking 17 years of stagnation of productivity. Why would that be? Well, digital skills gap in Scotland is pronounced. There's a big story there to do with educational inequalities, which feed into the decline of Scotland's education system. Also tied in with this would be low rates of business startups, low proportion of businesses that export in Scotland outside of the UK. Perhaps Brexit is a big factor there. Insecurities around the possibility of Skexit, Scottish exit from the UK, certainly doesn't help that. Low uptake and adoption of new technologies, huge problems. And if also think of the percentage of businesses that innovate, and it was 45, innovation active businesses in Scotland was 45%, 2014 to 16, and that dropped to 32%, 2016 to 18, going into the pandemic, which made it all even worse. Now, why is that important? Well, 32% business innovation in Scotland in 2018 was worse than it was in 2008 to 10, right off the back of the financial crisis. So from 2008 to 2018-19, Scotland's business innovation got worse and worse and worse. In 2008 to 10, business innovation was 33%. We went into the pandemic with a rate of 32%. That's catastrophic. And there are huge reasons that need to be gone into about why we're simply not innovative as an economy. And of course, finally, the last point within all of this, let's be fair to the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government have acknowledged some of these problems. £3 million were announced in the latest budget in additional funding for Scottish SMEs, small, medium-sized businesses, to help them on their, quote, digital journey. That's to be welcomed. £6.5 million for childcare. That will certainly not hurt productivity. But let's be honest, it's a drop in the ocean. It's grossly insufficient. So these are just a short overview of some of the economic challenges as I see it. That's a contextualization that as I would put it, inflation, aging population, business innovation, inequalities educationally, childcare, all of these things, and much, much more besides. So that's my opening take to contextualize it as where I'm sitting. And I thought I'd start with John. Is there anything in particular within that you want to pick up on and run with, or?
I guess I just one point I maybe start on is that I would probably disagree with your analysis of inflation and how it correlates with quantitative easing and monetary policy over the last 10 years, simply because it's not really backed by the evidence. Inflation, the relative high inflation we've got now is quite new, but quantitative easing and loose monetary policy, even negative interest rates, have actually been around for quite a long time without leading to inflation. It's only as we've had the pandemic and the Ukraine war and the supply chain issues, etc., that we've really seen inflation possibly exacerbated by the monetary stimulus that was put in place at the start of the pandemic. So certainly possibly exacerbated by that. But I wouldn't correlate quantitative easing, loose monetary policy with inflation per se, simply because the evidence has shown over the last 2 decades, and actually longer 2 decades in Japan. For instance, Japan was the first country to have quantitative easing in, I think, the late 90s. They first started doing it. And for a long period, they've never managed to really stimulate inflation. They were trying to stimulate inflation in their economy, never managed to do it. People just kept saving and not spending. So I'm not sure. I wouldn't be so negative on quantitative easing and loose monetary policy in that way. It was probably needed. It was definitely needed after the financial crisis. The more interesting thing was that in retrospect, we can probably look back and see that if we had known we were coming into a period of ultra low interest rates and then quantitative easing, we could have spent a lot more government money in the late 2000s and early 2010s. So we could have actually used a lot more fiscal stimulus, and that's apparent to us now in retrospect. And Liberal Democrats, who are the generation above me, who went into coalition, get a kicking for helping the Tories implement austerity, and the Tories get a kicking on austerity for in the late 2000s, early 2010s. But actually, if you look at the fundamentals of the markets, then when coming up to the financial crisis, the norm in markets was interest rates of 4 or 5%, and that was the refinancing rate you were looking at in gilt markets when the government was having to refinance its debt. It was actually reasonable to think we can't just have enormous spending programs because we're paying 4 or 5% interest rates to refinance. But that's very different when you're looking at paying 0.5% to refinance your debt. So you can actually run much bigger deficits when you're doing that. So that's just one kind of technical point I maybe disagree with. The rest of your analysis on productivity and structural issues around the Scottish economy, etc., I thought was all good. And there's definitely issues there that we need to tackle. And I think the problem is that in Scotland is, if I can generalise, we do an awful lot of talking and analysis about the economy and strategies to help the economy without a lot of action. So if you look at the Scottish Government over the last 10 years, there's been multitudes of strategy boards and advisors and strategy for this and strategy for that. And I did an article last year where I looked at some of this, and I pulled up a report from the Fraser of Islander Institute in 2018, where they had listed all the different quandaries.
I read that too.
You see that? So
I was just about to reference that,
Yeah, so their list was, so this was in 2018, there's probably more now. There was an economics, the Scottish Government had an economic strategy, a digital strategy, an energy strategy, a circular economy strategy, a climate change plan, a trade and investment strategy, a labour market strategy, social enterprise strategy, hydro nation strategy, strategy action plan for women in enterprise, STEM strategy, manufacturing action plan, youth employment strategy, innovation action plan, national islands plan, agenda for cities, and Arctic strategy. And then as well as all that, there was lots of sector-specific strategies, and then you had local authority strategies and everything else. So there's an awful lot of strategizing going on, and people working at cross purposes probably without having any clear, concrete objective in mind. And this probably ties into a point that's become apparent over the last year or so. It would be really good, I think, for Scotland to cut down in all this multiple overlapping strategies that we've got and have a single coherent, actionable economic strategy for growing the economy with a focus on one or two really key areas. So the green revolution is probably the obvious one.
Yes.
And creating that green industrialization that we completely missed out on in Scotland. Actually, if you look at the northeast coast of England from the Tyne down to the Humber, there is a green industrial revolution taking place there. Everything, the British Volt is building an enormous electric car battery plant north of Leith in Northumberland, or at Leith in Northumberland. There's the jackets for, or the turbines, etc., for wind farms are actually being built near Hull. So they've actually managed to do some manufacturing there that we haven't managed to do with BIFAB. So that's happening, and they haven't got a parliament coming up with all these strategies and putting in place talking shops, etc. They're managing to do all this just with local authorities, universities acting with local authorities and other things, and these people melding together and not being bogged down in constitutional issues or other things like that, and actually just doing the nuts and bolts of bringing capital together with innovators and entrepreneurs and getting things launched. And we seem to be not doing that in Scotland. And I suspect it's because we're doing far too much talking and analysing and being diverted by things like the Constitution rather than actually focusing on the economy.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I remember relatively recently the farrago over free ports versus green ports, and that was another example where a rather useful economic solution to depressed areas was held up because of constitutional game playing, frankly, which is just deeply, deeply frustrating. But yeah, and also in terms of what you were saying about the plethora of structures that exist, I remember, I'm just glancing at my article here, I wrote on the run-up to the last Holyrood election, I was writing about £44 million that the Scottish Government have spent on duplication purposes, where they've spent money on two different organisations, innovation and development hubs around the world, which also duplicate what Scottish Development International is meant to be doing. And so there's a duplication effort, which is just such an unhelpful waste of time and resources. And none of them really work as well as they should. So yeah, Margaret, do you want to comment on what John was saying?
Well, thank you. Those were both very interesting contributions and lots of interesting stats there to quote. So thank you, Jean, for that. That'll always come in useful. There's a couple. I mean, I think that last point that John made is really interesting, because I think it's so refreshing to have a conversation about the economy where we're not going to have to be judged entirely by what position you take on the Constitution. And and to get on to some of the other discussions that you have away from just that kind of framework that we're always working in. And what we actually need is some leadership in Scotland, and not necessarily always from the Scottish Government. Hopefully it can come from other sources as well, but leadership that gives some coherence to an economic analysis and an economic policy that I think can bring together the complexities that we need to address. And I'll come on to some of the issues I would want to emphasise, but also fuse that into a coherent plan of action. And I think it is that. What are the key actions that Scotland needs to take? How do we build a consensus for them? How do we make sure the key players, the key actors are all working in consonance with one another to actually achieve some results? Climate challenge is obviously one of them. Ageing is obviously one of them. And the one obviously that I would have an interest in is income inequality, because all the economic commentators will tell you that low income growth it's a real problem for the UK economy, but it's a particular challenge that we've got in Scotland. Now, the Resolution Foundation has done quite a lot of work in this, and most of their work, I think, is UK based. But I think they've done some work in Scotland as well. But they've talked about that toxic combination of low productivity, low income, and the impact of austerity and bringing that all together. And that kind of profound challenge that we've had with inequality in Scotland and the knock-on effect that has had, I think, is something that we really need to think about. because I think it's something like of all those living in poverty that you would officially recognise, 68% of those people are in work. And unless we actually begin to tackle that, so we've got that problem, put that alongside, as you said, Dean, the skills gap that we've got in Scotland just now, where businesses are consistently reporting they've got about a third, a third of Scottish businesses still say that the skills gap is holding them back. 62% are still struggling to find the right people. You know, now we understand that's often at the high end. We understand that. That's often, as you said, the lack of digital skills and such like. And I don't want to be facile about it. That's not necessarily an easy problem to solve just by, you think you can just tinker at the edges. But it does show you that we've got opportunities that we can find in Scotland. And I think we move on to talking about some of the solutions that we can find. Like, I hate to use the word strategy now, it's kind of loaded. I'm not suggesting yet another strategy, but we do have to look at a new approach to industrial strategy. And I think that idea of broadening economic terms, looking at what we mean of it, it's taken a decade to argue that childcare is an infrastructure cost, for example. That education actually contributes to the economy. And actually, if we got some coherence of those systems working together, I think we could begin to tackle that, as everybody says, that low productivity that has damned the Scottish and the British economy. And we won't actually move unless we begin to actually tackle some of those problems in the context of the crisis that we're facing at the moment. I mean, this is urgent stuff. If you look at the economic crisis, the cost of living crisis that we're dealing with, and some of the legacy, I take your point about the pandemic, but we've still got the tailspin of the pandemic to deal with. So good politics is about creating opportunities out of challenge. And you just don't feel that's happening very much in Scotland. We're not having the political conversation we need to have to meet some of these economic challenges, I don't think.
Well, there was one point actually on what you said there that that I thought occurred to me that I'll just throw out there for fly the balloon to see the kite to see how it goes. When you're talking about wages not keeping up with inflation, cost of living crisis, that feeds into the other problems because we have a labour shortage. There's rising demand. There's a labour shortage, especially with truck drivers and agriculture sectors. So we don't have enough people. And unemployment rate is what, 3.8% or something like that, if I recall. So the problem there is you're talking wage inflation, which we don't want, because because you'll have to raise prices to try and raise wage offerings to attract the workers. Collective bargaining has never.
But
frankly,
I think that's maybe one of the issues that I'm trying to say. I think we always look at these in very short-term issues as if what's the immediate, but we actually need to look at the long-term drives of the British and Scottish economies. And Rachel Reeves has done quite a lot of interesting work about it. I mean, and you should say as well that it's not wages that have driven up inflation at the moment. I mean, Mariana Mazzucato has done quite a lot of work that says, this is corporate. Obviously, it's the energy prices, but obviously the driving corporate dividends and such like has played its own part, which I've got some stats that tell you the rate that they've gone up at.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't want to say it's a wage-driven inflation right now, but that's definitely coming.
But if we only look and say that the only solution or a key solution to this is to drive down wages just now, I think that's a recipe for disaster for the economy, because it'll just
the challenge is to
dampen demand.
So I think it's fair. I think it's fair to say we need to increase the size of the labour force. We can all look around. You can go online and try and book a table at a local restaurant and find that they're only doing dinner 3 nights a week just now because they haven't got the staff to do 5 nights a week or whatever. Or local hotels where they don't have the restaurant open because they haven't got the hospitality staff. So there's clearly structural rigidities in the labour market there, which must be related to Brexit as well.
So, of course.
Yeah. So having a more open relationship with the rest of Europe, which Liz Truss has actually been talking about in the last few days if she becomes Prime Minister. So that's actually one sign of a bit of rationality maybe coming in there. And bringing more people in to do all this work means that it's not necessarily about the trade-off between wage inflation and price inflation, but it's just about there's economic activity, potential economic activity not happening right now because we don't have workers in place doing the work. And that's lowering GDP and everything else and growth. And if we can just get people in to do these jobs where there's a desperate demand for it, then that will increase growth and GDP and everything else and help solve some of these problems. It's just unfortunately when we live in an era of populism, and the rational economic arguments usually come second to populist arguments about keeping people out or identity or whatever. And that's what we're constantly sort of fighting against.
I think that's partly because we haven't addressed some of the fundamental issues about people who live, particularly when there's a concentration of people who have low wages and live in low wage economies. And, you know, whether it's in care work that you're engaged in, whether you're a delivery driver, you know, whether you're, you know, working, you know, the insecurity of this. And that's why the Resolution Foundation has done some really interesting work, I think, that's really saying, you know, we actually need to fundamentally address that, because if we make that the price to pay for economic change, then these problems will get deeper and deeper. Because if people feel that system isn't offering them any future to that, they look for other solutions, and people look for and are, you know, open to simplistic arguments about you know, Brexit will solve everything or independence will solve everything, without having these, you know, these deep-seated policy changes that we need. Well, you can't. Yeah, because of course you should invest in thriving sectors, and we need to look, especially after oil and gas in Scotland, we need to look at, you know, boosting productivity in our other performing sectors. But you also, and this is going back to the point I was going to make about Rachel Reeves, that, you know, integrating that change with an industrial strategy that talks about the everyday economy and looks at productivity in the retail sector, looks at productivity in the care sector, you know, it synthesizes education in with, you know, your economic issues. I think that gives you a much more hopeful offer of change, rather than just, you know, abandoning certain areas to economic dislocation forever. Basically, what's happening in some areas. I mean, if you look at just the sort of the state of the public realm in some areas, you know, which speaks to the economic disadvantage of the area. You know, that's just, it's a hopeless scenario for people. So you can understand why they'll look for other solutions.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I can speak to the state of the Scottish Railways. Someone who lived in China, I know what a proper modern rail network looks like, and not the Victorian, the legacy of the beach cuts that we live with here.
Look at the state of Glasgow city centre, and you would not think that is meant to be one of the most performing economic cities. I mean, it's, you know, we have got big problems to face.
In terms of town centres, city centres, that's also part of the rise of the digital economy, which is maybe an irresistible trend, which also brings in the issue of local government funding, which is not sustainable. Local governments don't have enough actual physical control over their own budgets, because you've got, in terms of Glasgow City Council, I think it's over 75% of their budget is not derived from the council tax. It's the funding from central government.
Everything,
And the SNP have this great addiction to ring fencing ever larger amounts of it, which means there's not a lot of flexibility for local governments to play with. And on top of that, there's almost, what, £937 million of cuts to local governments over the last 8 years by Holyrood to local governments. All of this makes it harder to actually do anything at a city or local level around childcare, town centre regeneration, whatever infrastructure projects, whatever it is. Glasgow Airport Rail Link was never built, and that's been promised by every party now for about over 10 years. So there's all kinds of issues there. And one other thing that John and yourself talked about, it was mentioned, I forget which of you mentioned it. It was, I think it was you, John, that mentioned government businesses with buybacks and so forth. BP has announced it's unleashing a $3.5 billion buyback and increasing their dividend after a tripling of their second quarter profits. They made $8.5 billion in the last 3 months of June, but they can't do anything about the gas prices that are going, in some cases, going to go over energy bills of over £3,000. You know, there is something to do with the fundamental structure of the cap.
I think there's a proposal to say that any government loan, any government bailout, any government grant should be conditional on that profits are invested in the long term. And should meet a green test as well. There's an argument about that. But you have to drive longer term investment in research and development in Scotland.
I think a big part of the problem here, and this is a pet theory of mine, there's always a variety of capitalisms, and I'm always been quite skeptical of shareholder sovereignty capitalism. I think it breeds short-termism, like you've got all this profit and don't reinvest it in the sector, don't cut prices for your consumers, do a buyback, more profit for their investors. That's a short-termism which is deeply, deeply unhelpful. Whereas you could have a stakeholder variety, which is more broadly based set of obligations, but then I run the risk of criticizing the Thatcher-Reagan revolution by saying all of that. But anyway, so John, inequalities, Lib Dems. What's the party's solutions to all of these problems?
Goodness, yeah, we'll probably be here all night if we simply start to talk. I mean, I think talking about the oil companies. So we and Labour did as well. We were very early talking about a kind of Robin Hood type tax, and the government finally came around to that. Looking at current profits, it wouldn't seem unreasonable to extend that and have another Robin Hood type tax for later this year or whatever, or have it at a higher level. Just as a way, because at the moment it's a kind of rentier system where the big energy companies are just kind of extracting rents from society as we all suffer. It's entirely fair to kind of in the interest of balancing things out and having a more equal society, of taxing them more in the short term, even if it creates uncertainty. And there might be a kind of longer term, more permanent solution which gives the oil companies certainty, where they automatically get taxed if oil prices and gas prices go above a certain level, or profits relating to that go above a certain level, and then there's automatically a bigger tax comes out of them, just to give them certainty over the future revenues, which, you know, because the thing they don't like is uncertainty. Am I going to have a random tax put on me? Fair enough. So what you're saying is it's not just trade unions that can hold the country to ransom. It could also be a slightly oligopolistic energy market. Well, all markets are prone to aspects of monopoly or monopolization like behaviour, which then makes them inefficient. And there's definitely a role for the state in always in being there and stepping in through regulation or other means to ensure that there's a fair market and it's fair for everyone involved, whether it's workers, managers, owners, whatever. So there's because if you don't have the state there intervening to create fairness, then naturally things tend to gravitate towards monopolies of power, influence, and money, which then creates a more stagnant society. We don't have social mobility, and you don't have any prospect of equality, etc. So there's always a role for the state there in doing that, and it feels as a sort of longer term trend over the last few decades that we've got to a point where, and this is probably particularly pronounced by the fact that real wages haven't really grown in Western in advanced economies over the last 15 years. We've probably got to the point where inequality has reached such a level where it's damaging to the social fabric overall, and things need to be done to try and redress that by governments. Now, that could be things like looking at a wealth tax. On paper, a wealth tax absolutely makes sense in terms of fairness, in terms of breaking down those barriers that I was talking about earlier, monopolies of power and influence and money, and just trying to create that more balanced economy. It's a really difficult thing to sell to the public, though, because a lot of people think I've made my money and been taxed on it already through income tax. Why should I get taxed on it again? as a wealth tax. But when you take account of the point that you made earlier, that the only reason people with stocks and shares ISAs have got richer over the last 10 years is because of low interest rates and quantitative easing, and the value of their portfolios has directly gone up as interest rates directly went down. And that might regress over the next few years itself as interest rates go up again to a more kind of the sort of trends we used to see in the past. But there's no getting away from the fact if you're asset rich, if you've been asset rich over the last 10 years, you've just got richer and richer. And if you're not asset rich, but you rely on a wage or welfare or a pension to get you by, then you've got poorer in relative terms, and you're getting a lot poorer now because inflation's eaten into that. So there's definitely things that government could be doing. In a rational world. We could do a lot more and be a lot more radical. Very difficult to sell a lot of these things to the public, though.
Margaret.
Well, it could be here all day. Well, there are real costs with inequalities that come too. And often the costs of, like welfare at the extreme point, I don't mean just benefits, but, like costs around drug abuse, costs around ill health, actually, can trace themselves back to not tackling equality properly. And I'm sure you remember the analysis from the Spirit level, whose authors I can't remember off the top of my head, but who found that they did very detailed research, very comprehensive research, and found that the most unequal societies have the most profound social and economic problems. And if you began to address inequality, you found that you improved those social indicators and economic indicators. I think they did it across 11 categories. So if you're having, it affects things like the level of prisoner population, the level of drug abuse, the level of things like obesity. So it's, when you're trying to, and we have those issues in Scotland, if you're actually trying to tackle those problems, rather than spending lots of money on little pockets of initiatives, you're actually much better trying to go to the root causes. So that kind of, there are financial benefits and economic benefits that can come from tackling inequality. And we have some discussions, I think, publicly in Scotland and the UK about where is wealth, who owns the wealth, where is it located, how it's manipulated and how it's moved. And I was just seeing some things recently just about, particularly in London, and the Russian oligarchs and how they've hidden wealth in London and how they've used the you'll know much more about this than I do, John, about how the system works in London, about how finance can be and money can be hidden. There's so much more to be done and just and financial transparency and financial accountability around the behaviour of some of that. And I think that there's a sense of justice around that and fairness. I think that people feel isn't properly addressed, and that's why they get this. It comes out in anger and resentment, and people see, the corporate greed, but don't see real solutions again from the political system for that. So, I mean, that's the kind of job of the political parties to get in and actually say to people there is a reasonable way through this.
So I think one of the problems is that whenever we have these types of discussions, they tend to go towards the extremes quite quickly.
Yeah.
So, even though I'm saying things like a wealth tax could make a lot of sense in a country like the UK or the US or France or whatever, I still think that markets work overall. I think I'm still a free market proponent. I don't want to see, I'm not anti-capitalist at all. Capitalism does work overall. Capitalism is the way that we lift people.
But you can regulate it better, can't you, to stop the abuses that are evident and go on, and how for example, the London property market works just now, or how offshore accounting works and such like.
Yeah, so you can regulate it in a way to create the right incentives for the proper behaviour and outcomes that are relatively fair. Well, in theory, you can. But the difficulty is how do you do that? So back in the early 2000s, for instance, Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling, etc., thought they were all doing really well with the banking sector in London because they were taking a kind of laissez-faire attitude towards. Actually, that's not quite right. People talk about the banks weren't regulated. The banks had actually never been regulated as intently as they were in the early 2000s before the financial crisis. But it's just that the thinking that underpinned the regulation was that the people in the banks who create all the risk management models, they're the smart people who know this stuff better than anyone else.
Well, what they did to us.
So we basically let them create their own models.
Yeah.
And as long as they're meeting a bunch of regulations with their own models, then we kind of sign it off and say we're happy with that. That system proved to be fundamentally then flawed and intellectually corrupt almost, and which led to the 2008 financial crisis. So, but the banking system was highly regulated. It was just regulated in the wrong way. We weren't being smart enough about it. So,
what would your opinion be on the separation of investment banking from your traditional banking?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that ever really. That happened initially in the 1930s after in the US after the.
And it was Clinton that did the strict separation.
Then after the financial crisis, there was another version of a similar act in the US. And then we never really did it here. And I'm not sure it makes much sense in the modern banking world to do it that way. Mm-hmm. I think, I mean, how you regulate banks is a whole other topic. But the kind of crucial point was that everyone thought they were doing the right thing in the early 2000s. No one's seen that banking crisis coming, including left-wing politicians like Gordon Brown and Arthur Darling. And that's not their fault. It was a phenomenon.
Nobody saw it. No.
Yeah, it was a phenomenon that the banking crisis and the financial crash that happened then. It wasn't. It's too simplistic to just try and lay the blame on a single group of people or whatever.
Oh yeah, it was a systemic problem.
Yeah, but that's kind of taking us off topic. Why was I talking about that?
I think we were talking about. I think your point. Forgive me for putting words in your mouth. Was if you're going to have regulation and transparency and accountability, you've got to make it work. It can't just you can't just cripple the sector through over-regulation.
Markets have to be allowed to innovate and
which of course is right.
Yeah, and then the political point I was making was that often when you start to have these discussions, they tend to be overtaken by people who are completely anti-capitalist and want to break the system. People on the hard left who are so extreme in their views that capitalism is bad. Anyone who thinks any different is a neoliberal, and then that tends to close down the conversation.
Can I ask you a question, John, as someone who's in that sector? I mean, it's back to the original point I think that Dean made. Part of the problem we've got is that the way that profits, if you like, in the very crudest definition of that, are going back to shareholders or going back to, and the profits are just increasing. They're not being used for sustainable long-term investment into research and development and innovation, which creates our productivity problem. Again, that's very crude and simplistic, but bear with me. But what my argument is, and I think people on the Labour side of the argument would be, is the state should increase regulation, increase mechanisms that drive behaviour towards that. I mean, there's a sort of moral point about transparency and accountability and not letting people abuse money, and I think there is abuse that should be tackled. There's probably crime that should be tackled as well, but abuse certainly, and that should be tackled. But the point is more an economic one. Which is more about driving the behaviours of corporate investment and how do you get that to pay for a long-term economic sustainability?
I'm not sure. I mean, the economic system, the financial system is set up in such a way that if there's a profit incentive there, then it will be fleshed out by entrepreneurs and others. And if there's inefficiencies, they'll tend to be worked out of the market. The difficulty is if you have too much state intervention and it's the wrong state intervention, you tend to just stop economic activity happening at all, and you stop the innovation and you but you need that. So I think that the ideal is probably to create the correct incentives to stimulate all the innovation and entrepreneurship and everything else, but then make sure that the profits and outcomes of that are taxed properly and then redistributed into the economy.
I get that, but I think it's probably more than just tax. I mean, I think the argument now is that, of course, tax and redistribution is central to a lot of it, but it has to be more than that.
It has to. I think it has to be more than that. I would share that point. I agree. I'm in favour of free markets, very much so, but I'm also in favour of redistributing the proceeds of growth. I think that's a Blairite term. That's a Blairite term. I think I've just exposed a bit of my political leanings there. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is we need markets to innovate. We need them to be productive. We need them to do what they do and do well.
But they don't always do that.
The last 100 years have seen, through the rise of freer trade, globalized trade, massive reductions in global poverty, real poverty. So it has been a success story. But as you say, regulation, the right regulation. But I go further. Right now, the principle, this whole legal fiduciary obligation for the big businesses, and we should not overstate them. Most businesses in the economy, the big employers, are actually the small and medium-sized businesses.
Yes,
I acknowledge that. But the big businesses, it's legal fiduciary obligation, deliver short-term profits to shareholders. So you get the government, what happened after the financial crisis, all this liquidity was created, government buying government bonds, etc., get banks lending again, encourage people to spend, not save. But a lot of banks used it sort of to rebuild their asset books and buy back shares and dividends for shareholders. There has to be more than just a short-termist legal obligation to deliver profits to shareholders. We have to have a more long-termist consideration by businesses over, as I say, stakeholders beyond just shareholders. Does that make any sense to anyone?
Yeah. I think bringing it back to kind of fundamentals at the Scottish level, education skills is really crucial, I think. And I think there was a big mistake made about 10 years ago when the SNP cut further education in college places by 150,000. And that's probably played into some of the problems that we're seeing now in the Scottish economy around productivity and other things. Because those college places were crucial for people skilling and reskilling, crucial for social mobility. So
keeping people in the education sector.
Yeah, and I think things like that, which tend to fly under people's radar, they're actually quite important.
I don't know if there's any research, but it must have hit the hospitality industry.
Yeah,
it really must have, because it won't be producing that sort of pipeline of people coming through it in terms of some of the, the HNDs, certainly HNCs that were being offered there, and certainly in the care sector, I'm sure it would have hit them.
Yeah. And there's lots of people from my sort of background who maybe didn't peak at school education-wise, maybe peaked later.
Exactly.
In their 20s, whatever, and then they need opportunities to go and learn skills or whatever at that point. So, there's things like that. And that cutting 150,000 college places was done to pay for free tuition fees to make up for that. So, well, it wasn't even free tuition fees, to pay for the graduate endowment, which the Labour Liberal Democrat coalition introduced.
Yeah.
And was not a tuition fee.
No, it certainly wasn't. I was there.
Yeah, it was a graduate endowment.
So, so there's things like that I think we need to do. We also need to attract more people from other parts of the UK, because there's a free market there already with tens of millions of people who, some of them should be eager to come and work here and have businesses and things here. So there's no language barriers, there's no legal or other barriers. It's just everyone works in the same system. They know how to pay their council tax and everything else. It's as easy to move here from England as it is from one part of Scotland to another. So we should be attracting workers that way.
That makes me want to probe both of you on a point there. UK internal market bill. There is a legitimate argument that it is being used as a means to sidestep devolutionary structures. On the other hand, there's a lot of it that does make sense in terms of making the UK internal market much, much more effective. What are your thoughts? Is that a helpful or unhelpful?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that I would have rather that bill wasn't needed at all, because we're still in the EU. So that would be the ideal scenario. We're still in the EU and we're in the EU single market, and that bill isn't even required. So that would be the first thing to say. Beyond that, if you accept the simple fact that we've come out of the EU and then unfortunately gone for an extreme hard Brexit where we've come out of the single market and the customs union too, then there was actually probably a requirement to have some kind of law which would ensure that similar standards would prevail across the UK, given that we were outside the EU single market. So I can understand that, given the circumstances, the unfortunate circumstances that we're leaving the single market customs union, that some sort of bill was required. Otherwise, you would have a government like the Scottish government, which is incentivized to be different just for the sake of being different, trying to create economic chaos within the UK by having different standards, etc. So it had to be done. It's also definitely something that could be abused by those who want to take power or money away from, spending power away from Scotland and centralise it around Westminster. And there's been one or two hints of that so far, but nothing really major. So we'll have to see how it plays out.
Mm-hmm. There's so much clumsy politics, I think, coming from both governments actually around some of this that it's quite distressing. You know, when I see some of the debate that's going on in the Tory party at the moment, you know, I know I'm politically biased, but gosh, you know, it does make you despair sometimes. And I think sometimes you could take the clumsy politics out of it and try and look at what's effective governance. You could perhaps come to a better arrangement here and have real and shared proper dialogue between all the constituent parts of the UK, and you know, and have sort of, I don't think we've ever done this. We've never created the proper architecture for a post-devolution United Kingdom, and we've got work to do on that does actually lead to rational decision making. And I think you're right, John. We need something like this given the terrible circumstances that we're in, but we could end up creating such terrible problems. Because I do think we have to respect devolution, and we have to empower the constituent nations and make sure that they have the powers. But don't let clumsy politics get in the way of it.
Yeah, I guess we may well have one government in London at the moment which disrespects devolution, but then we have another government in Hollywood which wants to destroy devolution.
Yeah, that's right. You end up with both of that.
Toxic.
And you do, when you're talking, I mean, as I said at the beginning, it's refreshing that we can actually just talk about some of the things like skills gaps in Scotland and, you know, financial systems and such like, and how that affects, because we just don't have the kind of logical discussions I think we need to have. And maybe there is some hope that when we get to that, we can create the public discourse you need to actually get you to some of those, that decision making that we actually need to have. And some of the trickiness around some of that, you know.
When it comes to questions around the economy, inequalities, possible solutions, there is a certain UK framework. The Internal Market Bill is necessary. We did leave the EU. Sadly, we don't have the opportunities Northern Ireland has, being still in the single market. Lucky Northern Ireland, despite the rhetoric of the Redwoods of John Redwoods of the world. However, more basic level, within this devolutionary structures, I would always be it's not a popular view, but I've long argued, do we need more MSPs to encourage a backbench culture in Holyrood? We need a reform of the committee system. MSPs need to have the kind of immunity that MPs have in the Palace of Westminster. The inquiry into the mishandling of sexual harassment allegations, that the so-called Salmond inquiry, exposed the shortcomings of all of it. So yeah, there is all of that, and all of this has an effect. For the first half of devolution, it was about spending money, not thinking or even talking about raising taxes, thinking about revenue creation. It was always just about our bailiwick is, here's the money, let's spend it. And that's begun to change quite dramatically since new powers were began being handed over from 2016 onwards. So that's a very welcome reform. But again, I'm worried about the habit of every time there's a sort of farrago, Holyrood and Westminster politicians just give more powers away. And there gets to a certain point where we do need to define the confines of devolution. But, you know, that's slightly off topic, but it's an interesting one for the future.
There is maybe one interesting point in all that, which is purely financial related, which is that post the Smith Commission and the new fiscal framework that we've got in place, which is currently being reviewed, there has been, obviously, the Scottish Parliament has more tax raising powers now, so it's raising revenue as well as spending it in a way it didn't before. But there's still not a direct link that makes the Scottish Government properly responsible, I think, for its tax and spend in a way that, say, the Westminster Government is. And that is a problem. And there may be an argument that, rather than thinking about the amount of power that goes to Holyrood versus the amount of power that's retained at Westminster in a kind of black and white way, in that way, it's probably smarter to think about in a more pragmatic sense about what's in a practical manner, what's the legitimate power that should be, or levers that should be sitting at a Hollywood level, and what's the ones that should be sitting at a Westminster level in relation to making government accountable for its tax and spending or to its electorate. And it's not working. Devolution is certainly not working at the level it should be just now. There could be an argument to actually extend borrowing powers for the Scottish Government on that basis, but it would have to be done so to the extent that a Scottish Government could issue Scottish subnational bonds. So in the same way that US states issue bonds and the US federal government also issued bonds, Scotland as a sub-state could issue debt directly onto capital markets and raise money for day-to-day spending, which can do. Actually, technically it can do that just now, but with very strict, a very small amount. But there's nothing to stop the Scottish Government doing that just now, but it's not gone out and issued its bonds out onto the market, which I'm guessing is because they don't want to have a credit rating that could fluctuate with speculation around potential independence referendums happening, because it would become more costly for them to borrow if it looked as if that debt was suddenly going to become a Scotland-only debt. But the way this works at the US state level is US states can borrow, but it's illegal under federal law for a US state to go bankrupt. So that takes care of the credit risk element. If a US state is approaching bankruptcy, it has to just sort out its spending to make sure it can still meet its bond commitments. We
don't want to end up with a Puerto Rico situation, though, do we?
What was the
Puerto Rico's not a state; it's a territory in America, but it has the.
That was a few years back,
and they're basically functionally bankrupt, but they're not allowed to go bankrupt. It's an absolute catastrophe.
Well, so it's the same for every US state. Also, although Puerto Rico is not a state, it's the same for all the states in the US. So this is just a thought. So I'm not. This is not lived in politics.
You're speaking for yourself. It's an interesting. I would support something
to create the incentives for the Scottish Government to tax and spend and potentially raise money and be properly accountable. So it can't just turn around and say we're not spending here because Westminster don't give us enough money, and if we had more levers, then we'd be doing it. Okay. I think there has to be some sort of different system for that.
Yeah, as I understand it, it's allowed. The Scottish Government's allowed to borrow up to a certain amount for capital, which would be infrastructure projects and stuff. But day to day, there are very, very strict rules around all of that.
Yeah, and there's a small amount of borrowing, relatively small amount of borrowing you can do for uncertainties in its budget from
it's to do with budget
reconciliations.
Reconciliations.
What it thinks it's going to spend and what it actually spends. So there's a certain amount of borrowing it can do around that, but the borrowing powers are relatively restricted. Although they could issue bonds if they wanted to. But there's a case that certainly in other federal countries, and maybe that's a fundamental problem, that we're not a formally federal country. So that makes it, because they don't have that underlying constitutional legal basis, that actually makes it difficult to set up some of these financial structures. But there's a case that could be potentially for reviewing that. But maybe all of this would be reviewed under, say, like a UK constitutional convention, where we talk about all this stuff, including some sort of form of full federal system, and giving everyone a voice. And I think if we continue with this conversation around, not here but in the country, around the constitution, the next stage should be a UK constitutional convention where we do talk about all these things properly. And my party would be wanting to, for instance, perform the House of Lords, as I'm sure Margaret's would, and turning it into a house of representing the nations and regions.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, and then as part of that, maybe the big financial arrangement, the big step for making Scotland and other nations and regions more financially accountable would be part of that.
Yeah, again,
to be the contrarian in the conversation, I'd probably not agree with in any elected upper chamber. I like the idea of a revising chamber. I think the House of Lords does do a very good job.
That's another podcast for you.
But that's a whole other discussion, because I could talk about identity cards, 90 days detention without charge, civil liberties.
Democracy maybe might come into electing people who make the laws.
If you have a bicameral system, both of them with elected mandates, you end up with.
Anyway, that's another podcast.
But this is another podcast, and we've went on very long. I think that was a very helpful discussion. Hopefully, my subscribers will find it enlightening and illuminating. Being able to talk about bread and butter issues surrounding inequalities, inflation, economic structures, possible solutions to do with, for example, like John was saying, perhaps Scottish government being able to have more bond and borrowing powers. There's lots of potential solutions. Also, reversing cuts to education, reversing cuts to local government, reversing a lot of centralisation and budget cuts that were made in Holyrood rather than London. There's a lot of potential solutions. Anyway, I thank you both for participating, and we were able to get into most of it without getting too drawn into the rather long drawn out independence question that at this point I'm tired of talking about. To be honest,
you might be more tired again.
It's here we go again. I think there's a song in there somewhere. Well, Margaret,
thanks,
Curran,
Dean. Thank you.
John Ferry.
Thanks, Dean.
For joining me.
Nice to talk to you, Margaret. Too.
And you, John. Nice to actually formally meet you. Thanks a million.
Thanks.